The turn of the key in the cold metal lock was the loudest sound Ethan had heard in 8 hours. 3 a.m. He pushed the door open to his third-floor rental. The space inside was thick with the musty smell of old carpet and the scent of burnt coffee from the morning before. Ethan closed the door carefully, holding the knob so the latch wouldn't make too loud a click. He took off his heavy steel-toed work boots and placed them neatly by the entrance. He didn't drop them, even though his feet numb and aching inside thick socks begged him to. Silence was the unwritten rule in this house at this hour. Ethan walked into the kitchen, the pale yellow light from the refrigerator casting a glow on the stack of papers scattered across the dining table. This month's electric bill was higher again, a notice for his car insurance payment, and a reminder from his daughter's school. He scanned them out of habit without a sigh or a frown. Those were problems for Sunrise. Right now, he just needed something in his stomach. He pulled out a plastic container of leftover spaghetti with tomato sauce from his daughter's dinner. Ethan stood leaning against the sink, not bothering to heat it up. The sound of the microwave would be too loud in the dead of night. He ate the cold pasta one spoonful at a time, chewing slowly. The sour tang of canned tomatoes and the soft, overcooked noodles slid down his throat, a reminder that another day was over. A day he had sold his strength-repairing lifeless machines in exchange for the fragile peace within these four walls. After eating, Ethan rinsed the fork and placed it on the stainless steel dish rack. Everything had to be clean before the sun came up. It was the discipline of a single father. He tiptoed to the small bedroom door and opened it. Light from the street lamp outside filtered through the curtains, illuminating the twin bed where Lucy was sleeping. She was curled up in her blanket, her brown hair splayed across the pillow, her breathing even. A worn-out teddy bear was cradled in her arms. Suddenly Lucy stirred. Her eyes remained closed, but her lips mumbled a question that had become a reflex. "Dad, you're home." Ethan froze, his hand still on the doorknob. He walked over and gently pulled the blanket up to her shoulder. "I'm here. Go back to sleep, Lucy." "Are you tired?" Her voice was tiny, sleepy, blending with the low hum of the space heater in the corner. Ethan was about to say his usual line, "I'm fine." It was the default answer, the armor he wore every day so his daughter wouldn't have to worry. But tonight, looking at that innocent face in the dim light, a small crack appeared in his armor. He let out a short breath, admitting something rare. "Yeah." "A little." Lucy didn't answer. She had already drifted back into a deep sleep. Ethan stood there a moment longer, watching the rise and fall of her chest. He lightly touched her forehead, feeling the warmth of life, the only thing that kept him grounded. He went back to the living room and sank onto the old, worn-out sofa. His body settled his joints, making a soft, crackling sound. Just then, the phone in his pocket vibrated once. He pulled it out. The blue light from the screen made him squint. A work message from the building's automated system. "Ticket number 4092, technical support request, central air conditioning system, location top floor, time 8:00 a.m. Ethan stared at the two words, top floor. His callous thumb swiped across the screen. The 40th floor. That place wasn't for people in gray uniforms like him. It was a world of crisp suits, expensive perfume, and million-dollar decisions. In his 5 years working here, he had only ever been in the basement, the machine rooms, or the mid-level office floors. He was the man no one called by name, the one who came to fix a jammed printer and disappeared before anyone even noticed he was there. But tomorrow, he had to go up. Ethan turned off the phone screen. Darkness returned to the small living room. The rumbling of a garbage truck on the main street drifted in a sign the city was about to wake. He closed his eyes, trying to coax a fitful sleep. His mind wasn't on electrical diagrams or loose screws. It was on a vague premonition, a feeling that the dull, stable peace he had worked so hard to maintain would, starting tomorrow, no longer be intact. Some people spend their whole lives just trying to keep things in order, but sometimes being stable for too long is just another way of fading away. Tomorrow morning, the invisible man would step into an elevator, press the button for the top floor, and walk into a place he was never supposed to exist. Perhaps we've all had nights like that, hiding our exhaustion behind an "I'm okay" to keep our loved ones from worrying. If you see a part of yourself in Ethan's silence, feel free to share your thoughts with us. But for now, as the night passes, the gray light of dawn has slipped through the curtains. Ethan wakes up, splashes his face with cold water, and puts on his familiar armor of responsibility. His new day doesn't start with a miracle, but with the small, mundane sounds of everyday life. The morning began with the clinking of a spoon against a ceramic bowl. At the small dining table, Lucy was trying to scoop up the last few Cheerios. Ethan adjusted the collar of his uniform, buttoning the top button, even though he knew it would feel tight later. He reached for his daughter's backpack, checking the zipper one more time to be sure. "Will you be home early?" Lucy asked, her eyes still fixed on her cereal. Ethan paused 1 foot halfway into his boot. He looked at her, then answered, "I'll try." The answer was the same as always, but his voice was deeper this morning. He couldn't make a promise. The top floor assignment hung in his mind like an invisible weight. He kissed her forehead, walked her to the school bus stop, and then headed alone toward the skyscraper in the heart of the city. Entering the main lobby, Ethan walked straight to the service elevators. He swiped his ID card. A dry beep echoed in the hall. The elevator doors opened. He stepped inside and pressed the button for 40. The giant machine began to move. There was no soft music like in the VIP elevators, only the faint hiss of cables and the changing air pressure. Floor 10, floor 20, floor 30. Ethan's ears popped. He looked at his reflection on the metal wall, a middle-aged man in a gray uniform, a heavy toolbox in his hand. With every floor that lit up, another layer of pressure settled on his shoulders. When the number 40 appeared, he took a deep breath and stood up as straight as he could. The doors opened. The space was so quiet, he could hear the soles of his rubber boots against the marble floor. The air was colder than in the lobby, carrying the scent of new paper and expensive solitude. In the middle of the vast office, Catherine Monroe stood with her back to the door, a Bluetooth earpiece in her ear, flipping through a thick file. Her voice was not harsh, but it was tense and full of pressure. "I understand the numbers are risky, but if we don't do this now, we'll have nothing left to discuss next year." Ethan stood still, waiting at a respectful distance. Hearing a sound, Catherine turned. She didn't look surprised or give him a condescending glance. She looked at the name tag on his chest, then gave a slight nod, a quick curt acknowledgement from someone racing against time with no mind for social pleasantries. She pointed toward a large dark desktop computer monitor, her eyes carrying a hint of exhaustion, as if to say, "Please just fix this." Then she turned away, resuming her conversation, her shoulders slumping slightly. Ethan understood. He approached the desk, setting his toolbox down gently. He sat in the chair and began typing the familiar command lines. The screen flickered to lifelines of code scrolling down. It was just a simple software conflict, with the display system, a job he had done 1,000 times. But as he hit the final enter key to reboot the interface, a hidden window suddenly popped open. It wasn't a financial spreadsheet or an HR chart. It was a photograph. In the picture, Catherine was standing by a lake, her hair messy from the wind, wearing a baggy sweater smudged with a bit of dirt. She was smiling a wide, radiant smile that showed her gums, her eyes squinting against the sun. No makeup, no black power suit, no pressure. Just a normal woman enjoying a moment of being alive. Ethan froze. His finger hovered over the keyboard. He was about to close it, but it was too late. The phone conversation behind him abruptly stopped. Ethan felt the air in the room grow heavy. He swiveled the chair around. Catherine had ended her call. She was standing right there, her hands at her side, staring at the computer screen, where her most private picture was displayed in the middle of her cold, sterile office. An oppressive silence filled the room. Ethan stood up, took a step back, and lowered his head in embarrassment. "I'm sorry I accidentally—" Catherine didn't scold him. She walked closer, looking at her own smile in the photo. Her eyes wavered. The professional mask cracked, revealing the bewilderment of someone who had forgotten what she looked like without her job. Then she asked softly, her voice so low, it sounded more like a question to herself than to a stranger. "In that picture, am I beautiful?" Ethan looked up. He looked at the powerful woman standing before him, her eyes shadowed with lack of sleep, and then back at the radiant woman in the photo. The question wasn't about vanity. It was the fear of someone who was slowly losing herself. Ethan didn't use fancy words. He chose the truth. He answered slowly in his deep, sincere voice, "You look happy." like you're in a place where you truly belong. Catherine froze. She turned to look him directly in the eye. There was no judgment in her gaze, only surprise. How long had it been since someone had spoken to her about happiness instead of profit? She was silent for a long time, then turned toward the large glass window, hiding the emotion that had just surfaced. When she spoke again, her voice was calm, but noticeably lighter. "The machine is fixed, thank you." Ethan nodded. He packed up his tools, saying nothing more to give her the private space she needed. He walked to the elevator. The metal doors slowly closed. Just before they shut completely, he saw Catherine still standing there, her silhouette looking strangely small in the vastness of the 40th floor. Ethan looked down at his hand clenched tightly around the handle of his toolbox. His heart was pounding. He realized that up here on the top floor, people were just as lonely as those on the ground. The elevator began its descent, carrying a small secret just shared between two strangers. At 3 p.m. The afternoon sun outside had faded to a pale yellow, but in the basement maintenance level, only the cold white fluorescent lights hummed from the ceiling. Ethan was wiping grease from his tools when the internal phone on the wall rang, a long, sharp ring that tore through the quiet afternoon. He picked it up. The voice of the secretary from the 40th floor came through polite but firm. "Mr. Caldwell, Ms. Monroe would like to see you. It's about the technical issue from this morning." Ethan held the receiver for a few seconds before answering. "I'll be right up." He hung up. His hand paused over the lid of his toolbox. He knew he had fixed the problem. A skilled technician never lets a machine break twice in one day. But he didn't question it, nor did he offer an explanation. His heart beat a little faster, not from fear of being reprimanded, but from a vague human curiosity. For the second time that day, Ethan stood in the elevator heading to the top floor. It was the same confined metal space, but the suffocating feeling from the morning had lessened. In its place was caution. He watched the numbers on the panel climb. He adjusted his sleeves, took a deep breath, and prepared himself to face the most powerful woman in the building. The doors opened. Unlike the morning's busy atmosphere, the office was now quiet. Catherine was sitting behind her desk, her hands clasped on the glass surface. She looked up as soon as he entered. No phone, no files. She nodded a greeting, her voice softer, lacking its usual sharpness. "Thank you for coming back up. The machine is still unstable." The statement was clearly an excuse. The computer screen behind her was bright and running perfectly. But Ethan didn't call her on it. He understood that sometimes people need a technical reason to address a personal problem. "Let me check," he said, his tone even. He pulled up a chair and pretended to type a few diagnostic commands. Catherine stood up and walked over to the window, her back to him. "Yesterday, I was a little strange, wasn't I?" The unexpected question hung in the quiet space. She didn't turn around, but Ethan could see her reflection in the glass. Her shoulders were slightly tense, waiting for a judgment. Ethan stopped typing. He looked at her slender back and answered honestly. "No, I just thought you asked a question that no one in your position would dare to ask." Catherine turned around. She looked at him for a long time, her gaze no longer that of a CEO, but of someone seeking empathy. "And you answered in a way no one has ever answered me." The air grew still. The only sound was the whirring of the computer's cooling fan. They both realized this conversation had derailed from work, but neither wanted to pull the emergency brake. They were standing at opposite ends of the social spectrum, but in that moment, the line between them slackened, pulling them closer. Catherine walked back to her desk, leaning her hip against the edge. She crossed her arms, but her posture was more relaxed. She looked at the old worn silver ring on Ethan's finger, a memento from his late wife, and asked softly, "You have a daughter." Ethan was surprised, then realized she must have seen his phone's wallpaper that morning, or perhaps his HR file. He nodded, a small, natural smile appearing on his lips. "Yes, Lucy, she's 8. I bet you love her very much." "So much I forget about myself," Ethan replied without thinking. It was the most obvious truth in his life. Catherine looked down at the sharp toes of her high heels. Her voice dropped as if she were talking to herself. "I forgot myself a long time ago, too, but not because I love someone." The words fell into the space between them, heavy and sad. Ethan didn't know how to respond without crossing a line, so he chose silence. Not the silence of indifference, but of respectful listening. In that moment, the repairman and the CEO became strangely similar. Both were people carrying so much weight that they had dropped themselves somewhere along the way. Catherine let out a soft sigh, as if releasing a small part of an invisible burden. She stood up straight, her usual composure returning. "All right. Thank you for checking." It was the signal that the conversation was over. Ethan closed his toolbox and stood up. Before he walked out the door, Catherine added her eyes looking directly at him. "If anyone asks, tell them I asked you to check the security system." Ethan nodded, understanding. "Of course, ma'am." It wasn't to cover up a mistake, but to keep this moment of vulnerability safe, a secret. Only the two of them knew. The elevator doors closed, separating him from that lonely, privileged world. Ethan leaned against the elevator wall and exhaled. The brief encounter had left a strange echo in his chest. The elevator descended. Floor 30, floor 20. Ethan pulled out his phone to check the time. The screen lit up. A new message from Lucy's school appeared on the lock screen. "Urgent, Lucy has a high fever. Please pick her up as soon as possible." The flashing red text made Ethan freeze. All thoughts of the top floor of Catherine's sad eyes vanished instantly. He hit the button to stop the elevator at the ground floor, not the basement. His breathing quickened. Between two worlds, a work life where a strange connection had just begun to form, and his sick little girl, he knew he had to choose, and he knew what his choice would be. The elevator doors opened, and Ethan rushed out, leaving the skyscraper slowly sinking into shadow behind him. The cold wind from the building's revolving door hit Ethan's face, snapping him back to reality. He stopped short on the sidewalk and pulled out his phone. The screen displayed his afternoon tasks. 2 printers on the 12th floor needed maintenance, and the hallway lights on the 5th floor were flickering. His thumb hovered over the Cancel Task button. If he pressed it, the system would automatically send an unauthorized absence report to management. It was a black mark on his personnel file, something a single father always tried to avoid. But the image of Lucy burning with fever flashed in his mind. Ethan bit his lip and pressed his thumb down firmly on the screen. Click. End shift. He turned off the phone, shoved it deep into his coat pocket, and walked quickly toward the bus stop. The number 42 bus groaned as it made its way through the crowded streets. Ethan sat in the back row, clutching his still-full lunchbox. The smell of the plastic box mingled with the diesel fumes, creating a familiar, suffocating atmosphere. He looked out the dusty window. The skyscrapers receded behind him, including the 40th floor, where he had stood less than an hour ago. Up there were plush carpets, the smell of new paper, and conversations about life. Down here, the bus jolted over every pothole, and in his wallet was a receipt for fever medicine from last month. The two worlds existed in parallel, and he was the only one drifting between them. The elementary school nurse's office smelled strongly of rubbing alcohol. Lucy was curled up on a small cot with a white sheet, her cheeks flushed. The school nurse nodded at him and said softly, 102 degrees. She just kept asking for her dad. Ethan walked over and sat on the edge of the cot. His calloused hand gently touched her forehead. It was burning hot. Lucy's eyes fluttered open, her eyelashes damp with sweat. "Dad," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "You're home so early? Did you get in trouble?" Ethan's heart clenched. Even in her feverish state, this 8-year-old child was worried she had caused trouble for him. He leaned down, adjusted the collar of her shirt, and smiled a smile that wasn't forced at all. "No one's mad at me. My work for the day is done. My only job now is to take you home." "Okay." He helped her up, draping her thick coat over her shoulders. Lucy rested her head against his chest, trusting him completely. Ethan lifted her onto his back. The weight of his daughter on his shoulders made his steps feel steadier. He walked out of the school, leaving behind all the pressures of adulthood to fulfill the one role that could never be replaced. The small apartment was bathed in a warm yellow light. The gurgling of boiling water on the stove was the only sound breaking the silence. Ethan gently stirred a pot of canned chicken soup, the steam fogging up his glasses. In the bedroom, Lucy was fast asleep after taking her medicine, her breathing less labored. Ethan turned off the stove and poured the soup into a bowl to cool. He sat down at the dining table, staring into space. The exhaustion was beginning to seep into his muscles, but his heart felt light. At the same time, in an office on the top floor, Catherine still hadn't left. She sat alone at her massive desk, a thick stack of personnel files beside her. Her fingers skimmed over the glossy resumes of directors, then stopped on a simple black and white printout on cheap paper. Employee file Ethan Caldwell. Her eyes paused on the line for family status. Widowed. One daughter, age 8. Catherine lightly tapped the words single dad with the tip of her pen. She remembered the look in his eyes that afternoon when he spoke of his daughter, a look that shone with a pride and love she had never seen in any financial report. She looked up at the window, the city below reduced to tiny specks of light. Somewhere down there, that man was making soup, taking a temperature, living a real life. She picked up her pen, intending to write a disciplinary email about him leaving his post early, but her hand froze. In the darkness that enveloped the 40th floor, she sighed. A sigh filled with a longing to return to a place that could truly be called home. A place where someone was waiting, even if only to ask her a simple question no one had asked in a very long time. Are you tired today? Tonight, in two worlds separated by height, two people were awake, connected by an unspoken understanding. 10 a.m., in the maintenance basement, humming with the noise of server fans, Ethan's computer screen lit up with a priority notification. He clicked it open. Meeting invitation system performance review. Location boardroom, 40th floor. Sender office of the CEO. Required attendee Ethan Caldwell. Dave, his colleague at the next desk, glanced at the screen and snorted, shaking his head. System's glitching again. Sent it all the way down here. Just ignore it, man, and go check the AC unit on the 4th floor. Ethan didn't delete it. He stared at the word required. He remembered the look in Catherine's eyes the day before, the tired gaze of a lonely leader who had asked him about happiness instead of work. She hadn't sent this email by mistake. She was calling him up there not to fix a machine, but because she knew he was the only person in this building who would look at the truth without an agenda. Ethan stood up. He went to the restroom, turned on the cold water, and washed his face thoroughly. He used a paper towel to wipe the dust from his plastic name tag and smoothed the wrinkles on his gray uniform shirt as best he could. You're actually going? Dave called after him, his voice laced with disbelief. Ethan didn't explain. He just nodded, picked up his worn-out notebook, and walked straight to the elevator. The 40th floor boardroom was colder and quieter than anywhere else in the building. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, but wasn't enough to warm the tense atmosphere. When Ethan pushed open the glass door, the murmur of conversation died instantly. 12 men and women in expensive suits turned in unison. Their expressions weren't hostile, just utterly surprised, as if a delivery guy had wandered into a black tie gala. Mark Reynolds, the chief operating officer, sat at the head of the table opposite the chairman's seat. He frowned lightly, tapping his fountain pen on the polished wood. Maintenance, I think you're on the wrong floor. The workshop is in the basement. I invited him. Catherine's voice cut through the room, not loud, but powerful enough to interrupt Mark. She sat in the chairman's seat, her back straight, her face unreadable. She didn't look at Mark. She looked directly at Ethan, nodding toward the single empty chair left at the corner of the table. Have a seat, Ethan. We were waiting for you. A silence heavier than the basement noise fell over the room. Ethan walked in and pulled out the chair. He placed his old notebook on the table, where it looked small and out of place among the new iPads and leather-bound portfolios. He sat up straight, hands on his lap, maintaining the calm of a father accustomed to pressure. Mark Reynolds cleared his throat, trying to regain control. He pointed to a bright red bar chart on the projector screen. All right, back to the issue. As you can see, operating costs are up 15%. System failures are constantly disrupting workflow. Mark clicked through the slides using a string of complex buzzwords: optimization, restructuring, redundancy reduction. He concluded with a sharp tone, the problem is the outdated tech infrastructure. The machines are constantly breaking down. The only solution is to fire the current maintenance team and hire an outside contractor with new technology. He spoke of the system as if it were a self-sabotaging entity, and Ethan's team were incompetent fools. Catherine listened without interruption. She didn't challenge Mark. When he finished, she turned her chair toward the corner of the table. Ethan! She said his name without a title. You're the one who physically touches these machines every day. What do you think of Mark's report?" All eyes turned to the man in the gray uniform. Mark smirked, leaning back in his chair, expecting a stammered, fearful response. Ethan stood up. He didn't look at the colorful chart on the screen. He looked at the people running the company. He spoke slowly, his voice deep and steady, using no management jargon. "Ma'am and gentlemen, machines don't just break on their own." He opened his notebook to a page filled with notes scribbled in blue pen. "Last week, the system flagged 40 errors. Mr. Reynolds is right, the server crashed. But I checked all 40 of those incidents." He looked up directly at Mark Reynolds. "The system crashed because the sales team has to enter the same data into 3 different windows to complete one order. They're tired, they're clicking too fast to meet their quotas, and the system overloads from conflicting commands." Ethan closed his notebook and placed his hand on it. "If we just spend money on new software, but don't change how people are forced to work, any system we buy is going to break too." The room was dead silent. No more pen tapping, no more rustling papers. The raw truth had been laid bare not by soulless numbers, but by the observations of a repairman. Mark's face turned beet red. He started to slam his hand on the table to object. "You're just a mechanic. What do you know about process? Let him finish." Catherine cut in her voice, now cold and sharp as a knife. She gave Mark a warning look, then turned back to Ethan, her eyes encouraging. Ethan took a deep breath and delivered his final line, wrapping all of his professional dignity into it. "I fix machines to serve people, sir. I don't fix people so they can serve a machine." He sat down. Catherine looked around the table. For the first time in months, she saw board members who weren't looking at their phones. They were thinking. When the meeting ended, Ethan was the first to leave, heading back to his shift without waiting for a word of praise. Mark Reynolds angrily gathered his documents. An older board member walked past Catherine and whispered, "You shouldn't let people like that in this room. It disrupts the order." Catherine replied calmly, her eyes still on the door that had just closed. "The system is deaf to the truth precisely because we've kept the order for too long." She knew from this moment on, the real battle had just begun. And she was no longer alone. Gossip in an office building always travels faster than any elevator. The next morning, when Ethan walked into the basement break room to get coffee, the room went silent. Colleagues who had been laughing moments before suddenly looked down, avoiding his gaze. Dave, the one who had advised him to delete the email, was now staring intently at the bulletin board on the wall. Ethan walked over. A single internal memo was pinned right in the center. The bold headline read, "Warning violation of conduct regarding criticism of management." Below it was a single block-quoted sentence, "If we just fix the software without changing the people, the system will break." His words. But they were mutilated. The context about the overworked sales staff was gone. The explanation about the flawed process had been erased. All that remained was a stark, isolated sentence that sounded like an arrogant declaration of war from a disgruntled technician against the executive board. Ethan read the words over and over. He wasn't angry. The feeling that rose in him was a deep, familiar sadness. He understood how this world worked. When the truth becomes inconvenient for the powerful, it is twisted into rebellion. He unclipped the plastic name tag from his shirt and placed it on the cold countertop. He offered no explanation to Dave or the others. Defending himself now would only look like fear. Ethan poured coffee into his thermos, screwed the lid on tight, and turned to leave, preparing himself to be fired. On the 40th floor, the atmosphere in Catherine's office was thick with tension. Mark Reynolds stood before her desk, placing a file stamped with the HR department's red seal in front of her. Violation of meeting confidentiality and insubordination. Mark said, his tone dripping with fake regret, but his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "I've already drafted the termination notice. You just need to sign it, Catherine. We need to stamp out this seed of rebellion before other departments get any ideas." Catherine looked at the paper. Mark's signature was already there, the ink black and decisive. He was backing her into a corner. Either she defended the rebel and lost credibility with the board, or she sacrificed an anonymous repairman to keep her CEO chair secure. She looked up at Mark, her eyes no longer weary like the day before. They were cold and hard as steel. "Who leaked the meeting minutes, Mark?" Mark shrugged. "What does it matter? The point is, he said those words." I think you should let me handle this. Mark pressed his voice, lowering with a veiled threat. Catherine stood up. She pushed the paper back toward Mark. No, I'll handle it myself. Mark froze, the smile vanishing from his lips. He picked up the file, turned, and walked toward the door, leaving a hanging sentence behind. Don't let your feelings ruin your career, Catherine. 15 minutes later, Ethan was in the CEO's office. He stood there, hands at his sides, his name tag no longer on his chest. He looked small in the vast room, but his back was straight. I didn't write that leaked memo, Ethan said, his voice calm. But I take responsibility for what I said. If the company needs someone to leave to smooth things over, I'm ready. He wasn't begging. He just wanted to hold on to one last piece of dignity for his daughter, so Lucy would never have to see her father bow his head for doing the right thing. Catherine walked out from behind her desk and stood opposite him. She saw the empty spot on his shirt where the name tag used to be, and she knew he was prepared for the worst. I know you didn't do it, she said softly, but Mark and the board want a name. Then give them mine, and let them win, Catherine asked, her voice trembling with a suppressed emotion. If you leave the truth you spoke yesterday becomes a lie, they'll turn you into a saboteur, and this system will continue to crush other people. Ethan was silent. He looked at the powerful woman before him. She was torn. She could take the easy way out and sign the termination paper, but she was standing here trying to protect him, a man who brought her nothing but trouble. I'm not staying silent because I'm scared, Ethan replied, his gaze softening. I just don't want to say anything else they can twist. A long silence stretched between them. For the first time, Catherine smiled, a bitter but genuine smile. You're like someone I forgot existed. Who? Me? A long, long time ago. At 3 p.m., an official email was sent from the CEO's office to the entire company with the board of directors CC'd. Subject: conclusion regarding system performance review. Ethan was checking a water valve in the basement when his phone vibrated. He opened it and read, "No violations have been recorded. All feedback during the meeting, including that from technician Ethan Caldwell, is considered constructive and reflective of the current need for improvement. The company recognizes this candor as a core value." At the bottom was the digital signature of Catherine Monroe. No apology, no lengthy explanation. Just a firm validation. She had used her power not to punish, but to shield the truth. Ethan turned off his phone. He stood silently amidst the sound of water rushing through the pipes. He took the name tag from his pocket and clipped it back onto his shirt. A small act, but one that carried the weight of restored dignity. At the same time, in the 40th floor office, Mark Reynolds finished reading the email. He threw his pen against the wall. He knew he had just lost a battle, but he also knew Catherine had just put herself directly in the board's line of fire. That night, Ethan came home later than usual. The apartment was quiet. Lucy was already asleep on the sofa, a comic book still in her hand. Ethan sat down at the dining table and opened his lunchbox. Inside, the container was empty, but there was a small piece of paper folded in 4. It was Lucy's scribbled handwriting, with a crayon drawing. In the picture, 2 stick figures stood on a green hill holding hands. Below it were the words, "Dad and me together. Forever." Ethan smoothed out the paper. His eyes stung. He realized that no matter how big the storm was outside, he would always have a perfectly safe harbor. On the other side of the city, in a large but cold penthouse, Catherine stood by the window, looking out into the night. She had saved an employee, but she felt more suffocated than ever. These glass walls, these political emails, were choking her. She picked up her phone and called her assistant, her voice decisive, but laced with a desire to escape. "Arrange a car for me tomorrow morning. I want to visit the branch office in the countryside. And let the technical department know I'll need someone to accompany me." She didn't say the name, but both she and the person on the other end knew who it was. She needed to get out of here, and she needed a trusted guide to find the human part of herself she had lost. 7 a.m. Fog still clung to the glass of the skyscrapers. Ethan stood waiting in the service lobby with his tool bag where company vehicles picked up staff. He assumed he was going with some regional manager to check on a faulty transmission tower in the suburbs. A black SUV pulled up to the curb. The driver got out and opened the back door. Ethan froze. The person inside was not a regional manager. Catherine was sitting there, her laptop closed on her lap, her head resting against the window. She was wearing a beige wool coat instead of her usual black power suit. Seeing him hesitate, she gestured with her head. "Get in. We're running late." Ethan got in, sitting in the opposite seat. The door closed, trapping the two people from different worlds in a small space that smelled faintly of leather and a light citrus perfume. "I thought you'd be flying," Ethan said cautiously as he buckled his seatbelt. "I need to see things from the ground," Catherine replied, her eyes still on the window. "I've been up high for so long, my view is starting to get cloudy." The car pulled away, leaving the imposing concrete towers behind. Soon the scenery changed. LED billboards gave way to rows of old oak trees and houses with sloping roofs. The silence in the car was no longer suffocating like in the elevator. It felt like a necessary pause. 2 hours later, they stopped at an old-fashioned roadside diner, the kind with red vinyl booths and the smell of French fries permanently in the air. Catherine walked in first. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with a notepad tucked into her belt, pointed to an empty booth in the corner. "Sit wherever you like, hon." No one recognized Catherine Monroe. No one bowed. No one was afraid. Catherine ordered black coffee. Ethan ordered hot tea. When the waitress placed 2 thick ceramic mugs on the table, Catherine lifted hers, the steam warming her face. She smiled softly, a completely relaxed smile. "This is the first time in 10 years I've eaten somewhere without someone watching which hand I use for my fork," she said. Ethan stirred his tea. "Out here, you're not the CEO. You're just a hungry customer." "Just a person," Catherine corrected. She looked around the diner where truck drivers were laughing loudly. "Have you ever thought about leaving the city, Ethan?" Ethan looked out at the dusty parking lot. "Every day, but Lucy was born there. She needs her school, her friends, and I need the company's health insurance." He paused for a moment, then continued, his voice lowering. "Poor people don't choose where they'd like to live, Catherine. We choose where we can survive." Catherine fell silent. Her finger traced the rim of her mug. His words were blunt, but held no self-pity. They reminded her what a luxury the freedom of choice she had truly was. "Yesterday," Catherine changed the subject, her voice wavering slightly. "Why did you say those things in the meeting? You knew you could have been fired on the spot." Ethan put his spoon down. He looked her directly in the eye. "Of course I was scared of losing my job. I have rent to pay Lucy's braces next month." He took a deep breath. "But I'm more scared of the day Lucy looks at me and sees a coward. I want to teach her to be honest, so I can't be a liar at my own job." Catherine looked down, staring at her distorted reflection in the dark coffee. "If my father had ever thought like you—" She trailed off. A flash of old sadness crossed her eyes, but she quickly hid it by taking a sip of the bitter coffee. They sat for another 10 minutes in silence, surrounded by the clatter of silverware and the sound of country music from an old radio. This healing space didn't need words, just the presence of two people who had finally taken off their masks. The sun was setting as the SUV re-entered the city limits. The skyscrapers reappeared, piercing the dark purple sky, bringing with them their familiar pressure. The car stopped in front of the building. Before Ethan opened the door to get out, Catherine called his name. "Ethan," he turned back. "Tomorrow I'm starting a new project, an internal culture restructure." She looked at him, her gaze determined. "I don't need million-dollar consultants. I need someone who knows the truth. Will you be a part of it?" Ethan smiled a gentle smile under the yellow glow of the streetlights. "I'll be there, but on one condition." "Anything. Don't call me technician anymore, and I don't want to call you ma'am either." Catherine paused for a second, then nodded slightly. "Okay, Ethan." "See you tomorrow, Catherine." Ethan closed the car door. He walked toward the bus stop with his tool bag, his steps feeling light. He didn't know that behind him, Catherine sat watching him go, and for the first time she no longer felt alone in the cold concrete city. 8 a.m. Monday. An email was sent from Catherine Monroe's personal account to all mid and senior level managers. The subject line was just 3 words: Project Restructure. In the body of the message, the most important line was in bold: Technical Lead and Process Advisor Ethan Caldwell. No fancy title, no MBA attached, just the name of a repairman from the basement. In the maintenance area, Ethan was checking the pressure on a boiler when his phone began to buzz non-stop. He didn't need to look at it to know what was happening. The gazes around him began to shift. It was no longer curiosity like before, but a mix of suspicion and envy. An unwritten rule of the corporate world had just been broken. Someone from the bottom had been given the power to influence how things were run at the top. Mark Reynolds read the email in his spacious corner office. He didn't throw anything or swear. He simply took a sip of his espresso, adjusted his cufflinks, and picked up his desk phone. "Get me the chairman of the board, now." By noon, the counterattack had begun. It wasn't loud like an argument. It happened silently and coldly through official channels. An internal petition was circulated by Mark, signed by 6 other department heads. The language was professional. Concerns regarding security risks when unauthorized personnel access core data. Ethan received a summons, but not to the 40th floor. He was called to the HR office on the 2nd floor. The HR woman didn't invite him to sit. She handed him a pre-printed form. "Due to a review of appointment protocols, your participation in the project has been temporarily suspended," she said, her eyes never leaving her computer screen. "While we investigate, you are being reassigned to the facility maintenance team for Sector B2, Sub-Basement 2. Ethan looked at the paper. The second sub-basement housed the building's waste management and sewage pipes. It wasn't just a demotion. It was a punishment. They wanted to push him even lower than where he started to make him disappear from the sight of the clean people. He didn't argue. He didn't ask why. He already knew the answer. He took the notice, folded it into fourths, and put it in his breast pocket. "I understand," he said. He went back to his old desk and gathered his few personal items, the worn notebook, his ballpoint pen, and a small photo of Lucy. Dave and the other colleagues kept their heads down, not daring to look at him. They were afraid of the fallout. Ethan quietly picked up his toolbox and headed for the service elevator, pressing the down button. The sound of the doors closing was as heavy as a tombstone lid. At the same time, in the private boardroom, there was no natural light, only the cold glare of LED lights on the black marble table. Catherine sat alone on one side, facing 5 board members and Mark Reynolds. "You're gambling the entire corporation's reputation on a plumber, Catherine," the chairman said, his voice deep and resonant, not hiding his disappointment. "Mark is right. This is an emotional decision." Catherine clasped her hands on the cold table. She looked directly at them, unflinching. "I didn't choose him based on emotion. I chose him because he's the only one who knows where this system is bleeding. You look at financial reports. He looks at reality." Mark Reynolds gave a small, condescending laugh, twirling his expensive pen. "The reality is, you're disrupting the order. If employees see that a technician can sit at the same table as a director, the hierarchy collapses. We sell power, Catherine, not fairness." Mark's words hung in the air, naked and cruel. Catherine was silent. She realized she couldn't win them over with logic because their languages were now completely different. They spoke of control. She spoke of people. "Stop the project." The chairman delivered his final verdict. "Or your position as CEO will be reviewed at the next session. And as for that fellow, Mark will see to it that he learns his place." Catherine stood up. She didn't nod or protest. She gathered her papers and turned to walk out of the room. The heavy wooden door closed behind her, cutting her off from the world of power she had once been a part of. 5 p.m., the end of the workday. The main lobby was packed. The clacking of high heels, the sound of laughter, and the beeping of ID cards created a chaotic symphony. Catherine emerged from her private elevator. She was exhausted, feeling as if she had just undergone surgery without anesthesia. She wanted to go straight to her car to escape this place. But then, 9 p.m., Sub-Basement B2. The air here was thick with the smell of dampness and the low rumble of the wastewater treatment system. Ethan had just finished his shift and was wiping his hands on an oily rag. As he walked out to the employee parking lot, the darkest, most deserted part of the building, a figure stepped out from behind a concrete pillar. It was Catherine. She wasn't wearing a suit. She wore jeans and a simple t-shirt, holding 2 paper coffee cups from a cheap convenience store. No driver, no bodyguard. "I need a place to start over," she said, without beating around the bush. "But I can't do it from the 40th floor. Mark is monitoring every move on the main server." Ethan took the coffee she offered. It was hot, warming his numb fingers. "What do you want to do?" "Project Phoenix. I want to build a parallel operating system, one that bypasses the redundant reporting procedures and focuses only on solving real problems." She looked him straight in the eye. "I need a lead engineer, Someone who believes in the system more than he fears it. Ethan took a sip of the coffee. It was bitter, but it was sharp. If you're discovered, you'll lose everything, Catherine. I've already lost the most important thing, respect for myself, she replied softly. Will you help me find it again? Ethan smiled and nodded. Follow me. I know a place Mark Reynolds would never set foot in. They set up their headquarters in an old equipment storage room in a forgotten corner of the sub-basement. It was a small, dusty room, piled high with old CRT monitors and tangled cables. For the next 2 weeks, a secret rhythm was established. By day, Ethan continued his cleaning and maintenance work in B2, enduring the scornful looks of the supervisors. Catherine sat in her 40th floor office, signing meaningless papers to keep Mark off her trail. But when night fell, they met in that storage room. There were no orders, no distance. Catherine sat on the concrete floor, learning how to crimp network cables under Ethan's guidance. Ethan sat at his old personal laptop, rewriting lines of code to optimize data flow. I never knew network cables had 8 different colored wires, Catherine said, fumbling with the crimping tool. Sweat beaded on her forehead. Each color has its own job. If you connect one wire wrong, the whole system slows down, Ethan explained without looking up from the screen. It's just like people. Everyone is important. It's just a matter of whether they're put in the right place. Catherine paused. She looked at the man working diligently under the dim yellow light of a desk lamp. Here, in this dusty room, she felt more at peace than at any 5-star resort she'd ever visited. Ethan, she called softly. Do you ever think we're doing something pointless? Mark could wipe this all out with one click if he finds us? Ethan stopped typing. He turned and took off his glasses, wiping them on his shirt. Maybe, but at least tonight, when we test this system, the night shift workers won't have to enter their data 3 times. They'll get to go home 10 minutes earlier. 10 minutes might be just enough time to wish their kids good night. He smiled gently. For me, that's enough to not be pointless. Catherine nodded, her eyes glistening. She went back to her mess of cables, but this time her hands were steadier. She wasn't doing this for profit anymore. She was doing it for those precious 10 minutes. On the 14th night, Ethan hit the final enter key. On the screen, a cascade of green text scrolled down like a rain shower. No red error messages. The system was processing data at twice the speed of the old platform. Phoenix System Online flashed on the screen. Catherine held her breath. She reached out and touched the monitor. It was working. Smooth, simple, and efficient. Just then, the storage room door burst open with a bang. The beams of flashlights swept across their faces. Mark Reynolds stood in the doorway, flanked by 2 security guards. He was panting, holding a tablet displaying a chart of unusual network traffic. I knew it, Mark yelled, his voice triumphant. What the hell are you doing, Catherine, using company resources for an unauthorized project, conspiring with a disciplined employee? You're insane. Ethan stood up, instinctively stepping in front of Catherine, but Catherine placed a hand on his shoulder and gently moved him aside. She stood up, dusted off her jeans, and faced Mark. The fear and hesitation of the past days were gone. I'm not insane, Mark. I'm doing the job you were supposed to be doing. You're fired. I'm calling the board right now, Mark screamed, pointing at the jumble of old hardware. Dismantle this whole pile of junk. Wait, Catherine said, her voice cold and sharp. She pointed to the screen. Look. Mark glanced over. The words, performance increased 200%, operational errors 0%, hit him in the face. He froze. As a businessman, he knew what those numbers meant. You can fire me, Catherine continued, stepping closer to Mark. But if you shut down this system right now, you'll be the one explaining to the board why you rejected a solution that could save this company, all because of your own ego. Mark gritted his teeth. He looked at Catherine, then at Ethan, the repairman standing there with a terrifying calm. He knew he couldn't destroy this achievement without shooting himself in the foot. He turned, jutting his chin at the guards. Let's go. Leave them here. Before he disappeared, he turned back for one last threat. There will be a summons from the board tomorrow morning. You might as well start packing your things. The next morning, 7:30 a.m. When employees across the company turned on their computers to start the day, they received an email from Catherine Monroe. It wasn't a farewell letter. Subject: announcing Project Phoenix, the new operating system. The email was brief with a link to the new work interface, the one she and Ethan had stayed up all night to finish. And at the very bottom, in a bold, formal font, lead system architect Ethan Caldwell. On the third floor where the office workers sat, whispers began to spread. People clicked the link. The interface opened fast and smooth. No more freezing, no more errors. A collective sigh of relief could be heard across the cubicles. Ethan was sweeping the corridor in sub-basement B2. He didn't have a computer to check his email, but suddenly he heard a strange sound. From the stairwells from the elevator bays, the sound of applause began to rise. At first it was scattered, then it grew louder. Employees walking past him, people who had once avoided his gaze, now stopped. They didn't say anything, but they nodded at him with eyes full of respect. Ethan stopped sweeping. He pulled out his phone and saw a text from Catherine. "We did it. Thank you, lead engineer." He leaned against the wall, taking a deep breath of the damp basement air. He didn't need the applause. He just needed to know that this morning, the work of hundreds of people in this building had become a little less miserable. But he also knew that the price for this victory was waiting on the 40th floor. One final meeting to decide Catherine's fate. 9 a.m. The boardroom. The air here was thick and colder than a walk-in freezer. 8 board members sat around the long oval table, their faces as expressionless as stone carvings. At the head of the table, Mark Reynolds sat with his arms crossed his eyes, unable to hide a look of triumph. Catherine stood at the opposite end. She did not sit. She had taken off her expensive watch and placed it on the table. "Ms. Monroe," the chairman began, his voice deep and dry, "you unilaterally approved and deployed Project Phoenix against all governance protocols. You granted core system access to a disciplined employee. How do you explain yourself?" The room was silent. They were waiting for an apology, a plea, or at least a defense based on profitability. Catherine looked around at them all. She felt no fear. For the first time in years of sitting in this chair, she felt free from the chains of their approval. "I have nothing to explain," Catherine replied, her voice surprisingly calm. "I didn't do this project to raise your stock prices. I did it so the people who run this system, the flesh and blood human beings on the floors below, wouldn't be crushed by a heartless process." "And who are you to save this entire system?" Mark scoffed. Catherine smiled faintly. "I didn't save the system, Mark. I just gave it back the humanity we cut out in exchange for profit." She gently pushed her CEO keycard forward. "If that makes me unfit for this room, then I accept that." In the ground floor lobby, Ethan sat on a waiting bench facing the elevators. He had changed into his cleanest work uniform. His toolbox was placed neatly at his feet. He looked up at the digital display above the elevator doors. The numbers climbed slowly. 38, 39, 40. Each number was a heartbeat. He wasn't worried about his own job. He was worried about the woman standing alone among wolves up there. The phone in his pocket vibrated. A text from Lucy. "Dad, I just finished my test. I got them all right. Don't worry, I believe she'll be okay. Good people always have happy endings, right? Dad?" Ethan read the message, a small smile forming on his lips. His daughter always knew how to light up the darkest moments. He texted back, "You're right, sweetie. They always do." He put his phone away and continued to watch the numbers. The number 40 had been lit for a long time. Then suddenly the arrow changed direction, pointing down. The boardroom doors burst open. Mark Reynolds was the first to storm out. He walked quickly, looking at no one, his face a thundercloud. He had won the power struggle, but he knew he had just lost the war for respect. Inside the room, the chairman looked at Catherine, his voice lowered with a hint of genuine regret. "The Phoenix system, we're keeping it. It's too efficient to discard." He paused. "But as for you, Catherine, we cannot tolerate this insubordination. You are dismissed effective immediately." Catherine nodded. "I know." She didn't feel sad. On the contrary, a sense of relief washed over her, as if she had just shed a heavy suit of armor she had worn for the last 15 years. She picked up her handbag, leaving behind all company documents. She walked out of the boardroom and down the long, empty hallway for the last time. The elevator doors on the ground floor opened. Catherine stepped out. She saw Ethan immediately. He was still sitting there, patient and silent, like a steady rock in the rushing river of people. Seeing her, Ethan stood up and picked up his toolbox. He didn't need to ask the outcome. The look of peace on her face said it all. They stood facing each other in the middle of the grand lobby. "Is the system running okay?" Catherine asked a casual question full of hidden meaning. Ethan nodded. "Very well. It has real people behind it now, not just cold lines of code." "Good." She smiled, her eyes bright. "That's enough then." There was no tearful goodbye, no regret. Catherine looked up at the large screen hanging in the lobby, the one that usually displayed stock market tickers. Today in the bottom corner, the internal system status displayed a small line of green text, Phoenix system operational. Status stable, lead EC. Ethan followed her gaze. He saw his initials there. He said nothing, just adjusted the strap of his toolbox. "Let's go," Catherine said. "Where to?" "Out of here, somewhere with real air." They walked side by side toward the main entrance. Ethan, the once invisible repairman. Catherine, the former. CEO, once lonely at the top. Now they were just two ordinary people walking on the same level ground. They stepped through the revolving glass doors. The doors spun, slowly pushing them from the cold, conditioned air out onto the sunny, dusty sidewalk of the city. The noise of car horns, people talking, and the smell of exhaust hit them. But to Catherine, it smelled like freedom. She took a deep breath and turned to Ethan. "Well, I'm unemployed now. Do you know any place that sells good, cheap coffee?" Ethan grinned the brightest smile he had worn in the entire story. "I know a place, and it's on me." They walked on, disappearing into the crowd on the street. Behind them, the skyscraper still stood tall, but it was no longer their prison. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't keeping the highest seat. It's daring to let go, and realizing you can still land on your own 2 feet. All it takes is one moment of living truthfully, one moment of trust, and one person willing to wait for you on the ground floor. If you're listening to this story and feel like you're stuck on some lonely top floor of your own, remember, the emergency exit is always open. You just have to be brave enough to walk through it.